So let's talk a little bit about the kind of nonsense that's going on in the knife form, at least within the lineage or grouping of lineages that I come from. There's a lot of stuff in there that seems more speculative. I don't even want to say theoretical because theory implies there's evidence, which there's not. It's just speculative techniques or angles. Never mind just the sheer lack of energy and intent in the way that so many of these early Ip-Man students practice. Even though I'm not from his lineage, I'm a bit of a Wang Lung fanboy, and even his knife form that we have a very, very poor video of has some stuff in it that's rather questionable. And the fact is that these knife forms, and every single Ip-Man student has a different knife form, and then the butterfly knives in general go across multiple Southern Chinese martial arts, and all of their knife forms look different. Like, no two have the same movements other than, obviously a cut is a cut, a thrust is a thrust, a parry is a parry, etc. But as far as how they're stringing things together, as far as how they're, formulating their techniques, there's a lot of stuff in there that seems based on either, performance or based on speculation. And I think a lot of that is just due to the fact that in these living lineages, right, all these people had to go through the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which changed martial arts, for good in China, and also just the nature of armed combat changing. We have evidence, I think it's up through like the 1920s, of people still using the paired knives, the hudi dao, right, the butterfly swords, butterfly knives, as weapons in gang combat. But I mean, as soon as pistols became affordable and reliable, people just went to firearms, and these more old school weapons kind of fall out of favor. In fact, you can go and look at an article I'll post in the description of this kind of social history of the knives. It's a fantastic, it's a long article, but it's a fantastic article that kind of goes through where the knives start showing up, and they're only popular for about 100 years, and then they go into the realm of performance and traditional martial arts, but they stop being used as weapons of self-defense. But I can't speak for the entire Chinese martial arts community. I don't know every instructor, so I am sure that there are people out there that absolutely know what they're doing with them and can make good on the usage. But as an American, and as somebody who has been involved in the HEMA community for a few years now, was it going on 4 years almost? Something like that. And the overall idea there, in HEMA, this is huge. It's not just reading the texts and practicing the moves, it's putting the gear on and sparring with it and seeing if we can make it work. And there have been a lot of things in the HEMA community where certain people said, oh, this one source is no good because we can't make it work. And then, a few months later, lo and behold, somebody goes to a tournament and makes those techniques work. It's figuring out the right context and whatnot. But the Chinese martial arts community is not really doing that. So a lot of this stuff turns out to just be forms and very, very, very static drills that never turn into like geared up sparring. And I think that is a shame, because when we have tools like the long pole and the knives, we need to actually be using them beyond just doing forms. As forms, they can help inform our empty hands, but they don't do a good job of doing that if we don't actually get out there and practice with them. To that end, we need to do like the HEMA community is doing. So this is a message to knife makers and blade makers and whatnot out there, somebody needs to step up and start making sparring worthy blunts for Chinese martial arts, Japanese martial arts. I think there are a couple of available ones for like the Chinese straight sword and the katana and things like that, but there's not enough of that represented out there. And when we don't have things that have realistic weight and balance, then it never quite gets there. So that's that side. And I know I'm rambling a little bit, and that's just kind of what this is. I just want to talk about this a little bit because, something that my Sifu had expressed was kind of a dissatisfaction in the lack of development with the weapons in Wing Chun. And there's a lot of people in Wing Chun like that. There are so many people in Wing Chun who end up going into Filipino martial arts simply for the fact that in Filipino martial arts there's a lot of small blades, and then of course these blades being somewhat antiquated, practicing with a stick, all of a sudden you start learning about how making it into improvised weapon and whatnot, translating the techniques into pocket knives and small carryable blades and things like that, and that's all great. But if you absolutely have to turn to another martial art to fill in the gaps of something that's already present in your system, then your system is broken or incomplete. And while that is entirely possible in this case, in this case, what I really think is happening is that we have simply lost a piece due to those cultural changes that happened. So let's look at a couple of things about the knives that could be better and have changed. So Roland Tong, who is one of the early Ip Man students, he was around in the 1950s, and don't kill me if I'm wrong, but I think it was 1954 when he joined up with Ip Man. And so, he was around in the early, street fighting days, and still is teaching at the Hong Kong Wing Chun Association as we speak. And he made a post on his Facebook account showing his membership card, which showed a picture of the knife as they used to be, which has kind of this triangular hatchet tip blade on this D guard, which is clearly not meant as a cutting knife. It is meant as a thrusting type weapon. And some of the accounts that we see do make it sound like the Chinese use them as cut and thrust weapons, not exclusively thrusting weapons, but the design of the knife definitely lends itself towards thrusting, stabbing, which is of course the more lethal action. The bigger, fatter, wider blades, like these, didn't start showing up till much, much later. Simply, I shouldn't say simply, there's for several reasons. But so the reason that our form is called the 8 cut, 8 slashing blades, whatever, is because the modern designs, the 20th century designs, before they fell out of favor and as they moved into performance, became that big wide blade. That could be to promote less lethal action. Cutting is debilitating, it makes a mess of people, but it's quite survivable. The whole cultural shift away from civilian martial arts because government crackdowns and whatnot. The very fact that a wide, shiny, polished blade like that for performing troops is going to pick up the light better, and when you don't have monitors and screens they can get close-ups, you need something that the audience can see when they're seated 50 feet back from the stage. So there's a few reasons there that may be the case. In fact, going a little further, one of the synthetic designs out there, this is a really, really common synthetic design. You see how that curves back? I mean, these would be so impossible to thrust with, and not really truly impossible, but it's so miserable to try to thrust with that it wouldn't be worth your time. But if we go back to that earlier style design, what we're seeing is something that, even if it is thrust oriented, we know that they did a lot of cutting and slashing with them as well. And it's a natural human movement. People are going to slash more than they thrust anyway. It's a less committed movement. But what we're seeing is these essentially operate kind of like parrying daggers did in Europe. And so when you start looking at 16th, 17th, 18th century dueling, it was not always, a side sword, a rapier, a small sword alone. Well, small sword alone probably, but rapier and side sword not generally alone, oftentimes with a parrying dagger. So a parrying dagger might look like this, is more of a German design, and we see the horns on it. Of course, it has a side ring, it's double-edged and all that, but it is pretty similar in size. It's actually a slight bit bigger, but pretty similar in size. Of course, these would have slightly thinner blades, whereas the Chinese ones had slightly thicker blades. But what we're seeing is the idea of a parrying dagger, a backup dagger, and contrary to popular belief, these knives did exist as single knives and not always as paired knives. We do have evidence of that. Again, look at that article that I'll link below. But the idea is this is a backup to a different weapon. In fact, some of the photographs that we have from that time period, it's not that this was always just a civilian weapon. While it never made its way into the regular military, it was used by the militia, and it was often a backup weapon to somebody wielding a spear, bow and arrow, musket. Spear and shield was really common, or even a saber. So as a backup weapon, or even as a parrying dagger, these start making a lot of sense. And looking at them in the terms of something that is both easily concealable, like a bowie knife in the Old West, but also as something that is a backup to a primary weapon, makes them kind of fit into a certain niche a lot better than what we put out there. So my personal set that you guys have seen in my video basically look like a bowie knife on a handle. These do not have the flattened one-sided handle meant for being concealed as as a paired but somehow concealed solo thing. There's none of that trickery. They have full handles, which I honestly prefer. I don't really care if it's truly traditional, because this is a living system. Living systems are not only allowed to, but supposed to evolve in the hands of each practitioner. In fact, when I got these, it was basically one of those things where when I saw them, I was like, this is exactly how I would design one for myself. I'm a huge fan of bowie knives, so here we go, more or less bowie style blade. The D-guard is nice. I don't know necessarily about the bamboo styling. I probably wouldn't have done that, but it's not irritating or anything. Nice rolled horn, plenty of room for me to allow it to flip, although that's not necessarily a tactic you would want to rely on. But there's also plenty of room in there as a catch, and that's how you use a parrying dagger. Is you often not only are sweeping your opponent's thrust to the side, you're actually often catching and fouling up his movement just for a moment so you can counter thrust him. Well, yeah, we're in a close range, but you can essentially do the same thing where one is parrying, catching, whatever, and the other one is attacking. This is an absolutely fantastic design. You can get these from everythingwushu.com. It's a direct from China thing, and it's cheaper than everything Wing Chun and good quality. So yeah, absolutely. I'll put a link for that in the description as well. But this is for me a more or less ideal design. I might make a few tweaks, and I'm a fan of brass. Maybe I've got a little too much French in me, but I would like a chunkier brass hilt. But I love the wood, although having the wood textured would be a little nicer. I don't mind the fullers on there. I know some people hate fullers, but a little bit of weight reduction is not a bad idea, especially because these are close range weapons and meant to be fast. So you don't want something that's too heavy. That's another problem with that kind of modern design here. These things feel like a hatchet in the hand. Yeah, there's a lot of authority in the cut, but they're not very nimble. I'm a fairly big guy and I'm reasonably strong, but it's still more irritating to use a poorly balanced tool than a much better balanced tool. So looking at things like that, we need to start analyzing the forms that we're doing and trying to put it into context. And if you can't get good sparring steel, which currently it's not available, there are some synthetic options. Purple Heart makes a really, really basic synthetic option. They're not cheap. It's $20 a knife, a little more than that actually. But they're big enough that you could actually stick a red dragon glove or a lacrosse glove in there, which is going to protect your knuckles for the sake of sparring. These, while these are the same pricing, they're so tight to the knuckles you can't stick a padded glove in there, which means that you can only do very, very controlled drilling, and you never get to work that kind of randomized stuff unless you're just willing to sacrifice your knuckles. Because the D-guard doesn't do near as much to protect you as you might think it does. So we need to absolutely be analyzing what we're doing in these forms and what these weapons do and what context they were in. That's another thing we need to be looking at, and this is the crux of what I wanted to get at. So many of the angles and techniques that we do in the forms don't make any sense in given context. Now, as a civilian, you might be going up against another civilian with a pair of those, although that, while they were common, that seems unlikely that you would be going weapon to weapon. I don't know how common duels were at that time point in China during the 1800s, but what is the likelihood of two guys pulling out a pair of these and then going at it? It seems pretty unlikely. You might have a guy with a single knife. You might have other contexts where a guy has, an improvised weapon or some other sort of weapon. Foshan has so many. It was such a hub of trade. There were so many things going through there. Who knows what was coming through? But then in the militia context, and this one's interesting, in the militia context, because other than archers and spearmen, you were looking at guys who were wielding sabers, and when you have a regular Dao, now this is, these are modern Wushu Daos. These do not have any historical precedent. Like the willow leaf saber would be more common, and Pu Daos would be more common, things like that, Da Daos. Something that size has way more leverage versus these. So you're not going to be able to do things a certain way. And what if you have a spearman or even just a pole wielder? Now we are pretty certain that these long poles were used more as training and conditioning tools for spearmen than they were as weapons by themselves. But they of course have martial capacity to them. But that being the case, even if somebody's attacking you with a 9-foot pole, this has different leverage, right? And again, in a military context, what if somebody's coming at you with, some kind of a pole arm, a spear, or one of the larger, pole arm style Daos? You don't have the leverage with these things to do a lot of this stuff. And then the range is an issue too. That's a huge difference in range. Never mind going up against a pole arm or something. So a lot of the stuff that we're doing in the forms, like these split ganshaos, it doesn't make a lot of sense, because if I'm going up against a pole arm or even just a standard saber, I'm going to be out of range for that top one to be cutting anything. Potentially you might be able to cut the hand, but right, if the low one is blocking, then where's the hand? It's not there. And I'm not going to be in range for the neck, the head, the body. So it doesn't make sense. So you should probably be doing some kind of a reinforced block and then running in, which is actually what we see, at least in our form. Our first 4 sections are kind of designed against a pole arm. If it's a thrust, I don't need to reinforce, but this one hanging out is doing nothing. And if it's a cut, I do need to reinforce, or even just a beat with a pole arm. But say it's something like a pudao, you might actually need that reinforce, never mind the fact you're gonna have to step in and beat the leverage, like moving down the handle on a baseball bat, severely reduces, the power of the swing, all those kind of things. This is not a block. This is a shitty block if you're thinking this is a block. You might be able to hook, but again, depending on what you're trying to hook, that may or may not be a wise idea. And the idea of being able to turn this and use this in the same tempo as somebody attacking you is pretty low. Now, are there reasons why you might just end up like this in the middle of a fight, fumbling your knife, whatever? Yeah, sure. I mean, we can come up with all sorts of scenarios for that. But that's not exactly what we need to be, looking at in this case. I mean, because essentially forms are juggling. You're learning dexterity and movement and stuff. Maybe it's just learning how to handle your knife, similar to some of the rifle drills that they do in the military. Stuff that would never happen in the battlefield, but gets you more acquainted with your weapon. That being said, you're not going to block anything like this. This is going to be extremely rough on your wrist and hand trying to block something. And again, if you're going up against a weapon that has much, much better leverage, then you're going to be running into some trouble with this. And when we do this, well, this is really just lining it up against your forearm, just like you would do a reverse grip on a small knife. And would usually just be used for attacking. You wouldn't really be using it as a defensive tool. You're not going to block something like this. The risk of something rolling over and still cutting your arm is too great. The risk of this bouncing off of your arm is too great. Never mind the fact that the spine of the blade cutting into your forearm is going to just suck. So looking at stuff like this and doing these kind of movements where we're cutting down, cutting across, that's just murder. You're just getting in close and murdering the guy, which is fine. You could potentially use it to clear a guard or something, which is fine. Again, you're not meeting any kind of force with it. This is not something that we do, not something you see in any of our forms, but I've literally seen people do this kind of thing. That is completely asinine. There is no reason for you to ever do something like that. And again, maybe you're just learning how to juggle, but it doesn't make any kind of sense. Better off to get into that gansha mode where you're actually reinforcing the blade and kind of scissoring in on top of somebody's weapon, trying to jam in on a cut or jam in even on a thrust. Although again, you probably don't need a reinforced thing for a thrust because you're not meeting the force. There's a lot of stuff in there that's just flat out nonsense. There are places where originally it would be a jam or jat kind of idea down low, and then I'm cutting in front. Well, how am I going to cross your weapon and cut you here? Again, this is a nonsense kind of position. You probably need to move your cut to an angle. You're probably going to be taking an angle. So some of these things just make more sense once you start actually sparring and drilling with these things as opposed to just moving through a form. You're just not going to find some of the positions in the forms to be very useful. The last thing I want to talk about, and this is a big one, in HEMA and when you talk to Filipino martial arts guys and even Japanese and Korean sword arts and things like that, everybody's very, very big on don't crane your wrist over, right? You don't want to get into a broken wrist position. This is no good. So when we are doing these kind of like casting cuts where they kind of punch and then flick, you need to be letting this cast through your hand into a handshake grip or a saber grip, right? Handshake / saber grip, saber grip is usually with the thumb up, and we're not necessarily doing that. But a handshake grip is still a pretty strong position, and I'm not going to be putting a lot of strain on my wrist that way. And it does allow me to accelerate the tip a little faster, which gets a little more speed for the cut. Not necessarily going to do a ton more damage, but it does allow us to get just a little bit more, and then it gives us kind of that cool recoil action, bringing it back to guard a little bit faster, using some of the wrist energy like we use in our forms. But absolutely don't hammer grip the thing and then crane your wrist over. That is no good, bad on your wrist, not good for cutting, not good for thrusting at all. So again, these are things that you learn when you actually start practicing sparring, harder drilling, actually practicing cutting. These aren't sharp, but I've done some cutting with other swords and whatnot, and you can absolutely feel a difference in the power of your stroke when you have a stable position versus an unstable position. So again, if anything I said is not traditional, I don't really give a fuck, because at some point this is a living system that needs to continue to grow and evolve, and if sometimes that means going back further than the tradition into the actual history and figuring out what the context was and trying to do that and then moving forward from there, then that's what we need to do. I guess that's it. I think I'm gonna just be done talking now. I've talked your ear off long enough. No, I got a small story for you. Sorry, I'm gonna keep talking. When I was in junior high school, I think it was around 6th grade, Power Rangers came out. And around that time was also the time that I saw the Michelle Yeoh Wing Chun movie. And that movie was my introduction to the butterfly swords, and I immediately fell in love with them. I didn't know anything about Wing Chun. I mean, seeing that movie, I thought Wing Chun was just because the character is Yim Wing Chun. I just thought it was the name of the character. I didn't know this movie was about a martial arts style, and of course there's not really any Wing Chun in the film, but whatever. The fact is that I saw those knives, and I thought that was the coolest thing ever. And when I would start drawing, myself as a Power Ranger, because, you do that when you're a kid, I would always draw my weapon as these. And I think it is absolutely fantastic that I kind of just happened to fall into a system that uses these knives. It's just kind of a cool little thing to be able to fulfill a childhood dream completely unintentionally. Didn't seek it out, it just kind of happened. And now I actually know something about them, and I can use them, and I want you guys to be able to do the same. Whether it's these or some other weapon that you've done a lot of forms with and whatnot, you need to look beyond the forms. You need to look beyond the drills even. You need to get into the habit of learning how to gear up and spar, even if you have to use makeshift equipment to do that, and start figuring some of this stuff out. Because there's a lot of really, really pretty things in forms that maybe just learning to juggle, maybe dexterity, right? But may also be conceptual things that shouldn't be taken so literally. All right, with that being said, I'm gonna get out of here. I'll talk to you guys later. Good journey.